Thank you. Good afternoon. The workshop will reconvene. It is now 2:41 or 2. Thank you very much. To remind you, the purpose of the workshop is to air issues, flag issues, illuminate issues to help us all in our task as we review the matter and decide what actions we may take. The next non-governmental organizations panel, number 2, there you are. Take it away. Nice to see you. We're not at public comment. We took one when somebody had to make the make an airport, but we have 2 more panels and then we'll be on to public comment.
Ms. Marcus,
Afternoon.
members of the board, I'm Gary Bobker, Program Director at the Bay Institute. We've got a panel of environmental and fishing and wildlife organizations. All of our groups have expressed serious concerns or formally protested or objected to previous temporary urgency change petitions and orders. The concerns that we have about the very extreme impacts to estuarine resources, estuarine health, and the implications for how effectively the state is managing the estuary's resources during the drought they're ongoing, they're not trivial, and we need to address them, but we're not going to use this workshop venue to revisit all of the issues that we've identified for you that I think you're very familiar with. What we want to do in, and we don't want to get, I think, sidetracked into revisiting, specific past decisions and past effects, except as how they illuminate what was going to happen. And I don't think we want to get sidetracked into responding to problematic and sometimes deliberate confusions about that equate reductions in environmental water use with reductions in consumptive use, which I think helps confuse the issue about what's really happening in the extreme nature of the impacts to fish and wildlife resources. What we want to focus on in this panel is what the situation is for the rest of 2015, how we can avoid continuing unreasonable levels of impacts to fish and wildlife, particularly salmonids, going forward, and what the board can do to avoid those impacts. We're going to start with NRDC and the Bay Institute. John Rosenfield and Doug Obigi are going to discuss the first part, the conditions that led us into a situation where salmonids continue to be at risk, what the factors are that are creating that situation and how we can avoid it. Tim Sloan from the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations and John McManus of Golden Gate Salmon Association are going to talk about the concerns of the fishing industry and the fishing communities about the impacts of failing to protect our salmon populations. And Rachel Zwillinger of Defenders of Wildlife will address the issue of how actions to protect fish are consistent with actions to protect birds and other wildlife. I may make some concluding remarks or help answer questions from the board as appropriate. So the first part, which is presented jointly by NRDC and The Bay Institute focuses on a couple of main points. The first is that the actions that we've taken in the past resulted in a loss of temperature control that caused an incredible high level of mortality to winter run and fall run. Going forward into 2015, relying on the temperature model is likely to underestimate future impacts to salmon. The current operations right now make it look like we're likely to recreate some of the problems of 2014. We're releasing more water than is necessary to maintain temperature control, and that will likely have impacts later in the year. And so the board has an opportunity to address that situation by limiting releases in order to maintain temperature control later in the year. And we're going to walk that through first John Rosenfield and then Doug OBG.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I'm John Rosenfield, conservation biologist for the Bay Institute. And I wanted to talk about the retrospective of what happened with Chinook salmon in the Upper Sacramento River last year. But before I do that, I was hoping to put some of the numbers and conversations we're having in a little bit of historical context. I'm showing here on the screen the Sacramento Valley. It's the highlighted section. Down in the lower part of the screen is San Francisco Bay and the Delta. And then obviously the upper part shows the extent of the Sacramento River drainage all the way to the northeast of the state. And the part that I've circled here roughly, as well as PowerPoint could allow me to do it, is roughly the historical range of winter run Chinook salmon. At this time of year, historically, winter run would have migrated into the McCloud and the Pitt River, Hat Creek, etc., where they would experience cold water that they need to spawn and complete their early rearing. With the construction of Shasta Dam, obviously they're not able to get to that range, and so this area that's bracketed by the yellow bracket there now shows sort of where we are able to protect them when there's sufficient water in the Sacramento River below Shasta Dam. That's a very constrained geographic range, and I want to emphasize that the constraint on this fish's geographic range is a huge threat to this population. You know, the saying about having all your eggs in one basket applies when your entire population spawns in such a narrow stretch of river. In 2014 and 2015, the range we're talking about roughly is this bracket on the right there that I don't know whether you can see, but I guess that's kind of the point. It's a very, 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 very small range that we're now constraining the winter run Chinook salmon into. And this in and of itself, population abundance aside, productivity aside, that situation is an extreme risk to this population as it would be to any vertebrate. Another thing that I want to put in context, we've heard about the 95% mortality that winter run Chinook salmon experienced last year. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but I wanted to emphasize that high freshwater survival rates are crucial to the Chinook salmon life history, to their very existence. These fish live in the ocean most of their life, come into freshwater, spawn, and die. And that very bizarre life history is only made possible because survival in the freshwater ecosystem is relatively guaranteed, is relatively high. So historically, or I don't quite know about historically actually, but typically for Chinook salmon up and down the coast living in managed ecosystems, managed rivers now, a typical Chinook salmon population between these two green bars here, one roughly where Shasta Dam is and one where salt water begins down in the Delta, would experience 90% mortality or 10% survival throughout their freshwater life history. Last year, we lost 95% of the Chinook salmon before they had gotten to Red Bluff, or by the time that they had gotten to Red Bluff. Obviously, that's not the complete freshwater journey. That's not the rest of the river. That's not the Delta. So when we talk about 95% mortality last year. That's extremely high, and really I would expect that we've lost the entire wild cohort last year because of the mortality that occurs after the first place that we measured them, which was at Red Bluff. Another thing to put in context is a lot of the modeling and discussion we talk about is the 56-degree temperature threshold for incubation of Chinook salmon eggs. And I want to emphasize that while 56 degrees is the regulatory number that's used, it's used in the biological opinions and the board's order 90-5, 56 degrees is the threshold between suboptimal conditions and detrimental conditions. 56 degrees is not good incubation conditions, and so hitting 56 degrees is not in any way like a good thing. It's just not an awful thing. It's not a catastrophic thing. So optimal temperatures, just for reference, are below 53.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 12 degrees Celsius. 54 degrees, 55 degrees, 56 degrees. You see a little bit of direct egg mortality, a little bit, but what you're really beginning to see is suboptimal performance of the juveniles that come out of those eggs. You can think of this like nutrition in humans, right? You can have no nutrition and die when you're young, or you can be malnourished, live, but that's not necessarily a great thing if you're just experience mortality early in life after you get out of your young stage. Then we have the temperatures that we actually saw last year, which are these 57, 58, 60, etc. And I've indicated here the rough percentage of mortality of a clutch of eggs per week that you would experience at constant temperatures associated in the rows. But again, these mortalities of eggs do not include the mortality that you then also get for the eggs that survive. When they hatch out of the eggs and become juveniles, they are poorly formed, they're in very poor condition, and they suffer additional mortality as juveniles, which is not captured in these numbers. Okay, so now to what happened last year. This is the temperature modeling output from April of last year that I'm sure you're all familiar with now. The blue line down on the bottom here is projected temperatures coming out of Shasta, Keswick. The green line, of course, was the line of interest. That was the temperature control point for last year, and it showed barely maintaining the 56-degree temperature threshold through the winter run Chinook salmon incubation period. But again, I want to emphasize that it's barely holding on to the transition between suboptimal and detrimental. All of these temperatures are producing sublethal effects for the juveniles, right, and lower survival than you would otherwise expect. But again, as we know, the temperature model was incorrect. It is generally incorrect in particular in dry years. And so this is the actual temperature trace that we had from last year, where temperature control was lost really in about mid-August and then sort of went off the rails in the beginning of September, causing high mortality. This is a comparison of the modeled temperature, the black line, compared to the actual temperature coming out of the Shasta-Keswick complex. And here you can see again that obviously the blue line, the actual temperatures were much higher than the model predicted, and that resulted in temperature mortality. But I really want to emphasize that there's only about a week, 10 days in here where this temperature model tracked reality. Early in the year, warmer water was released. Not such a great problem. It's still in that not so great zone, that suboptimal zone for the fish, but it's at least below 56 degrees. But you would have expected that releasing this warmer water earlier would have freed up, made available more cold water later. So this is really a terrible performance by this temperature model, and again, things sort of went off the rails in the beginning of September. So in the retrospective analysis, in NIMF's letter to reclamation of January 29th, 2015, they found that temperatures were upwards of 4 degrees higher than Sacramento River temperature modeling results 4 degrees is a big difference in terms of Chinook salmon incubation success and subsequent juvenile success. And that was played out then in the monitoring of the actual monitoring of juveniles in the system at Red Bluff, where the winter run in brood year 2014 experienced approximately 95% temperature-related mortality, far greater than what was predicted by last year's forecast. And again, that doesn't account for mortality experienced downstream and in the delta. To conclude my section of it, I just want to note we've been talking about winter run. Fall run Chinook salmon experienced extremely high temperatures as well. You know, these temperatures of, so this shows the red line is temperatures coming out of Keswick. The blue line is temperatures at Bend Bridge. So this is the entire theoretical range of Chinook salmon that we think about. And all of these temperatures are well into the high mortality range. And a point that I think Mr. Milligan made this morning about, you know, some of these fish are, you know, females, right? They're not eggs in the gravel yet, and so they can tolerate a little higher temperature. I thought that was the implication of what he might have said. Actually, we know very well that females exposed to high temperatures produce eggs that are less viable than females that are exposed to good temperatures. So as a result, we saw high mortality to, I mean, as a result of the direct mortality on the eggs, the female exposure, the suboptimal juvenile development, we saw very high mortality for fall run Chinook salmon as well. And Doug will describe that.
Thank you, John. Doug Obigi with NRDC. So we attempted to, because there's been a lot of focus on winter run mortality last year, but not as much focus on fall run, which is the backbone of the state's salmon fishery, and the Sacramento River wild populations of fall run are an important component of that. So we attempted to do a juvenile production estimate of what survival was last year using data from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's 2014 report to the department. And what it shows is that fall run survival appears to be as low as 1.8%. So we basically lost 98+% of the fall run that were produced above, you know, spawning below Shasta Dam. And you can see that in the passage estimates. This is a recent data grab from Fish and Wildlife Service's monitoring at Red Bluff Diversion Dam. And you can see that the passage of juvenile fall run Chinook salmon is less than half of what we saw coming out of the collapse of the salmon fishery. It's the lowest level that we've seen in a very long time, and it is extremely disturbing because we're not just affecting winter run, but we're affecting fall run, really is affecting the entire life cycle of these fish and the jobs that depend on it. Our concern at this point, what we really want to focus on is what are we proposing to do differently this year? And unfortunately, we're very concerned that we're going to see a repeat. Maybe not as extreme as last year, but a lot of that will really depend on things that are beyond our control, like the temperature, as Mr. Milligan said. And praying for colder temperatures is not exactly a strategy for sustaining fish and wildlife and avoiding unreasonable impacts. Just to sort of go back, you know, the board has this year cut the delta outflows by nearly 50%. You know, the critical year flows are dramatically lower than what's required in a wet or above normal year. So as the Department of Fish and Wildlife said today, we really are constraining the estuarine fisheries, the pelagic fisheries, and that lack of outflow really is adversely affecting delta smelt and other fish in the delta. It's also affecting salmon. You know, we all know that survival through the delta dramatically changes for salmon depending upon the amount of outflow there is. Bad outflow years like this mean lower salmon survival in the delta. We've basically, the board has cut delta outflow standards and X2 standards to meet human needs. We're only meeting the, you know, basically export water quality as staff presented this morning. And as a result, you know, early estimates were that this, from the board, that this would reallocate nearly 1.2 million acre feet that was from the April order by the board. It may have gone down since then, but we're seeing a huge reallocation of water from the environment, and that is directly jeopardizing the existence of delta smelt and winter run. And not only is it having these short-term effects, but really I think one of the disturbing problems is that what we've seen in the past with droughts, and we're seeing it with this one, is that cutting outflow has long-term effects on the health of the estuary. You see greater populations of invasive species, you see the harmful algal blooms. These are not things that last just a year and go away. These are things that can cascade for decades or years and potentially become permanent changes to the estuary making it far less friendly for native fish and hurting all of us, including water quality for drinking. This was a graphic from the drought contingency plan that the agencies prepared. And the two blue dots indicate different projections of Shasta storage. The gray lines indicate the ability to meet different temperature targets. And so you can see that, they estimate that you should have 3.3 million acre feet of storage in Shasta at the end of April to meet the Clear Creek temperature control target through September. That's not even getting through the fall, where we saw so much of our problems last year. End of April storage was 2.6. So we're well below what they anticipated was necessary. At the same time, the drought contingency plan suggested or stated that we would limit releases in April and May to the minimum, to 3250, so that we could conserve upstream storage. We completely missed that. And that was driven largely by the need to meet water demands by upstream contractors, particularly the settlement contractors. This is a comparison using the modeling that the board required the agencies to do, looking at the Salmon plan, which really just cuts flows to meet temperatures, and the state board scenario. And you can see that in nearly all of these months, reservoir releases from Shasta, Keswick are dramatically, in some cases, particularly in April and May, higher than what we needed to maintain temperatures. And that's having a very detrimental effect on our ability to meet temperature control later in the year. We've lost the opportunity to deal with April and May. We really blew that one. But we do have an opportunity in some of these later months to limit releases even just a little bit so that we can maintain better temperature control. Because if you look back at that model, at the model temperatures, we are right on the knife's edge. And if the model is 4 degrees off or 2 degrees off again this year, you're going to see a repeat of that kind of very extreme mortality, which will have cascading effects for not just the wildlife, but for the human jobs that depend on it. Yes?
And it's not actually a question for you. It's a question either for Diane or Tom. My understanding of that, it's not even a reopener, it's that report to Tom that's necessary, was that it wasn't, the TUCP wasn't a approve and go, it was approve, monitor, and report if you're going to miss it, that there was more in it so that we wouldn't just blow past something.
That's
I'm not
correct.
saying that well.
Right,
Can
no,
you explain
yeah,
that just a little bit to me so that I really
So
understand?
the approval that Tom sent to the Bureau of Reclamation indicated that the Bureau of Reclamation should meet the temperature target of 56 degrees at Clear Creek throughout the temperature control season, and should adjust their plan and notify Tom immediately if they believe that they're not going to be able to achieve that plan. So that, I think...
Notify and then what? It's presumption
and modify
that
the plan.
Modify the plan,
Right,
not just
right.
notify for the heck of it.
Right. But, Doug's correct that as the season goes on, your options for
Become
making
smaller.
changes are smaller and are more drastic.
If at all
Thanks.
possible.
I just wanted to be clear on that versus just assuming it.
Yeah, no, I mean, really, once you get into July, August, you really have no good options. This is really kind of your last chance to do something that might be able to conserve, to keep us just a little bit from being in a very bad situation when we know the model is inaccurate. We know the inaccuracy works to the detriment of fish and wildlife.
I think also just, to answer to the previous table with that yellow, it seemed in the earlier presentations today that the flows were taken from different levels of the reservoir so that they were trying to not deplete the cold water, and that these higher flows correspond to warmer temperature waters. Does that change this analysis at all?
Not really. You would be able to, if we had released less water early in the year, you would still have more cold water available because you would have a greater volume. You wouldn't see that sort of heating of the water as it stratifies. It is to some extent a zero-sum game. It's not necessarily a linear game, but there are consequences here. And we've seen that the side gate does not work as designed, particularly in the dry years. And we're once again running up to that problem of relying in part on the side gate starting in August and then solely on it in October, which is when you have fall run in the river. I think I really appreciate the work that staff did this morning presenting where the water is going. One of our concerns has been that we're seeing many of the settlement contractors and exchange contractors are getting a lot of water. And that is, fundamentally at odds with protecting the fish and wildlife resource. And there's been some talk about sort of the choice between protecting the estuary and protecting salmon. That's a false choice that ignores the third leg of the room, or the third leg of the stool, which is all the diversions that we're taking out of the system. Last year we took 2/3 of all the water, all the runoff in the watershed were diverted and were not made available for fish and wildlife. I would expect that we're going to see something similar. And it does lead to some very perverse results. This is a chart showing the allocations to the San Joaquin River exchange contractors compared to the entire natural runoff of the San Joaquin River. And you can see the blue bar is the runoff and the red line is the allocation. And what it shows is that every year for the last 3 years, the exchange contractors have gotten, according to their senior water rights for which they've made a contract with the Bureau, they're getting more than 100% of the natural runoff of the river. That really raises questions about the reasonableness of that contract. Ultimately, what we are asking the board to do is to direct staff to require the Bureau to modify operations so that we do reduce diversions or releases from Shasta, Keswick in the summer months, to limit them to what's necessary for temperature so that we have a better chance of actually meeting temperature control. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues from the fishing industry.
Madam Chair, the board, thanks for having me. My name is Tim Sloan. I'm with the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. And I just wanted to take a quick...
Congratulations.
Excuse me?
Welcome and congratulations.
Thank you very much. And Zeke is in the house today, so just so you know. I just wanted to take a quick moment to connect my colleagues' remarks to the jobs that are on the line here. The fishing industry in California is valued at $7 billion and supports 150,000 jobs. And in large part, those jobs depend on healthy, productive salmon runs, especially in the upper Sac. And I might add that job's ultimate goal is to provide a nutritious source of protein that also happens to be delectable and supports our food security as a nation. Last year's loss of temperature control at Shasta is already affecting our ability to fish. I don't know if you followed how the Pacific Council set the salmon season this year, but in large part, we were curtailed both over area and time for concerns about the fall run, or excuse me, for the winter run. That massive mortality on the winter run is already cutting out huge swaths of area for us to fish, huge amounts of time, over 2 months south of Point Sur and at least a month and a half south of Monterey. The loss of the fall run isn't going to play out until 2017 when those fish begin their run from the ocean back up the river, but we're very fearful about what the presence of fishing opportunities are going to be like that year. You need to do better. This board has the authority to insist that the Bureau builds in at least some modicum of a cushion to facilitate achievement of temperature goals in the upper Sac. Last year's plan missed the mark, and we should strive to improve on our past failures. The costs of this are pretty short term. We're going to push some water deliveries back, but we could be losing a species and an industry that depends on it. Thank you.
Mr. McManus.
Now is it on? Hello, board. John McManus, Golden Gate Salmon Association. I guess I'd say yeah to what Tim said, and add just a few things. Tim noted that we're already restricted this year because of winter run impacts. We're worried about next year and the year after big time. We could get shut down. If we're not, it will be because of the hatchery fish that we truck to build ourselves a little bridge over what's certainly to be a decline in the natural run. Whether it's 95% or 90%, we know we had a disaster last year in the upper river, both with winter run and fall run. Hard to imagine we didn't with the springers and the late falls as well. I haven't seen those numbers or studied them, but they've got to be there. It's been very interesting to sit here and listen to everybody all day. Board Member Moore, I think you noted when Ron Milligan was speaking that they're cutting it awfully close to the edge. And something that Doug said was, Even with all the monitoring that Executive Director Howard has required, theoretically we could get to a situation where the monitoring shows that the temperature is going off the rails and they could be out of water. And this could be a really dangerous situation. So we're really concerned about this summer. We've heard arguments on both sides that temperature control will be maintained. It will not. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. I come today to ask that you guys have your staff, your scientists, take another look at this plan and see if you've got the margin of error built into it that it needs. That's basically what it boils down to.
And hi, I'm Rachel Zwillinger, and I'm Defenders of Wildlife's Water Policy Advisor. And what I hope to do today is to talk a little bit about what we view as the relationships between operations to protect endangered fish and efforts to protect terrestrial species as well. And so Defenders agrees with our co-presenters that the situation for winter run Chinook salmon, particularly this year, is dire. And we join them in requesting that the board modify the operative orders and the Shasta temperature plan to reduce reservoir releases during the summer months to the levels necessary to achieve temperature compliance and to shift some releases and diversions to the fall. And what we really want to emphasize is that we don't make this request lightly, because we realize that the request could have implications for rice production in the Sacramento Valley, and we firmly believe that rice fields are critically important habitat for migratory birds, for giant garter snakes, and for other wetland species. But we also believe that water allocations have to reflect our modern ecological realities, and that we can't continue to remove so much water from the rivers that we're driving our species to extinction. Instead, we have to find ways to maximize habitat value with the limited water that's available. And among other things, this requires a commitment to providing water for post-harvest rice decomposition, which provides the primary habitat value from rice fields for migratory birds. In this instance, shifting Shasta releases from the summer to the fall could provide a win-win situation for wildlife if it's managed correctly. The delayed releases could make it possible to achieve temperature compliance and could also provide water for rice decomposition. We also want to emphasize that making additional water for rice decomp this year is particularly important because we believe the fall water transfers could have a substantial impact on habitat in the Sacramento Valley. In particular, it appears that the agencies are moving forward with water transfers involving rice idling that don't include important safeguards that are necessary to protect terrestrial species. These safeguards include carefully selecting parcels for fallowing to ensure connected, high-quality giant garter snake habitat remains. And I'll emphasize that the biological opinion, the programmatic biological opinion for the giant garter snake that was recently released doesn't ensure that sufficient high-quality habitat will remain. Another safeguard that we don't see happening is the requiring of the cultivation of non-irrigated cover crops on fallowed parcels for migratory bird habitat, and prioritizing water deliveries to wildlife refuges, particularly south of the Delta, over deliveries to entities purchasing the transferred water. If the agencies fail to implement these measures, the transfers will likely significantly and unreasonably impact giant garter snakes, migratory birds, and other wetland species. In light of these impacts, a modification to the Shasta temperature plan that makes more water available for rice decomposition could be critically important for providing replacement wetland habitat. For these benefits to accrue, however, we also need water users to commit to agricultural practices like flooding for rice decomposition that truly benefit wildlife. We want to thank you again for taking the time to hear all of these comments today, and we hope that you'll act swiftly and that you'll do everything in your power to make sure that water management decisions don't further imperil our species.
Thanks for letting us go through that whole presentation. The final remark I want to make is that when I appeared before you several months ago to protest a previous temporary urgency change petition and order, I remarked that if you decided to go down the different path and to approve the petition and to relax standards in the spring, that you really had to make sure that you got the benefits that were being hypothesized of protecting resources later in the year. There's a real potential that you are not going to do that. And so please take the time to make sure that you consider what actions are available to you to prevent a repetition of last year's conditions for salmonids, and take those actions, because the margin is thin and it's disappearing quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you. Very laid out very clearly and very helpful in the sea of paper that we all have to read. These help illuminate and point us in a direction. Thank you for crystallizing the issues. Our next panel is the Waterbirds panel.
I'll begin by thanking the board for allowing us to speak today about the effects of the California drought on waterbirds, especially waterbirds in the Central Valley. I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Mark Petrie. I'm representing Ducks Unlimited. My fellow panel members are Mark Reynolds from the Nature Conservancy, Ellen Ware from the Grassland Water District, Jeff Volberg from the California Waterfowl Association, and Mike Lyons from Audubon. Mike couldn't be here today with us, but his sentiments are expressed here. Just to provide you a little bit of background, I'm going to speak specifically to waterfowl. There are about 6 to 8 million waterfowl, wintering waterfowl in the valley. That's actually the highest density of wintering waterfowl in the world. So if we're looking for context, I think that provides it in terms of the importance of the valley to waterfowl. We've lost about 90 to 95% of our historic wetlands, which raises the question, really, how do we continue to support such high densities of wintering waterfowl? Well, the answer is we have a tremendous amount of waterfowl-friendly agriculture, and the wetlands that we do have, we intensively manage for food production. So that's how we continue to get it done, despite the fact we've lost that many wetlands. If we're going to talk about the impact of the drought on waterfowl, we really need to talk about the impact on their food sources. And really, there are 3 main food sources in the valley: managed wetlands, rice fields that are winter flooded after harvest, and cornfields. When we're trying to really figure out what the impact of the drought is on those food sources, there are kind of really 4 within-year mileposts. They're the degree of spring plantings, principally rice and corn. There is summer irrigation of wetlands, which is important for actually increasing food production within those managed wetlands. There's the actual fall flooding of those wetlands. And then finally, there's winter flooding of harvested rice fields. So if we want to kind of take a look at a normal water year, what we're anticipating being on the ground for the current drought, in terms of planted rice, we typically have about 570,000 acres. This year, we're looking at just over 400,000 acres. In terms of grain corn, we typically count on about 62,000 acres. This year, we're looking at about 35,000 acres of planted grain corn. In terms of summer irrigated wetlands, in a normal water year, we would typically irrigate 60 to 70% of all the managed wetlands out there. This year, we're anticipating 10% or less of those wetlands will actually get summer irrigated. In terms of fall flooded wetlands, normal water year, we're looking at about 207,000 acres. This year, we're anticipating about 155,000 acres of fall flooded wetlands, of managed wetlands. Winter flooded rice, about 350,000 acres has been normal in recent years. We're anticipating somewhere between 50 and 75,000 acres this year. So that kind of draws you a bit of a picture in terms of what the landscape is looking out there, or what we're thinking it'll look like out there this year compared to what we would call a normal water year. I just want to step back a little bit and emphasize the issue of summer irrigation. It often gets overlooked when we're talking about the drought impacts, but it's actually very, very important. It's almost a hidden effect. We summer irrigate about 70% of our managed wetlands in a typical year. Again, we're estimating only about 10% in 2015. We do know that food production in non-irrigated wetlands is only about 56% of irrigated wetlands, which means when you put that together with the fact that we're only going to flood about 155,000 acres compared to the normal 207,000 acres, what all that adds up to is about a 50% declines in the amount of food that will be provided by managed wetlands this year. So it's a combination of effects. It compounds one another. If we're looking to kind of see what that means from a waterfowl perspective, this is typically how we try and convey that, and this is a hypothetical graph that I'll kind of run through quickly and then show you some actual results for the valley. But essentially what we do is we estimate food energy supplies and food energy demand for waterfowl out there in the valley. If you look at the blue line, that is population food energy demand over time, and typically as bird numbers increase in early fall through December, you see a peak in that population food energy demand, and then as birds begin to leave the valley, begin to migrate, population energy demand essentially falls off towards spring. In terms of food energy supplies, as we begin to flood habitats in fall, early winter, we see a big increase in those food energy supplies. That flooding is typically done by November, early December, after which we see the effects of food consumption, food depletion, and so those two lines eventually come together. Right now in the valley, in a normal year, we essentially have just enough food. The food supply and food demand curves essentially meet up there in the March period. But this is what we're predicting. That's the supply-demand relationship will look like in the current year. As you can see, we're forecasting running out of food sometime in early January, mid-January. Now, we made a similar forecast last year, and essentially, we were saved by the big December rains. They kind of came in and they rescued everything. That's kind of our immediate concern from a waterfowl perspective, what's going to happen in 2015, but we also have long-term concerns as well. And really, a lot of those long-term concerns focus on rice and the post-harvest practices that are associated with rice. In the past, prior to the burn ban, most rice fields were burned. California rice fields produce a lot of straw. Producers need to get rid of those straws, otherwise they face disease problems in the subsequent planting spring. But typically what was done in the past was these fields were burned. Burning is actually a very waterfowl-friendly practice. It gets rid of the straw, but it doesn't destroy the waste rice seeds. They're essentially there on the surface for the birds to find. So essentially, it was a very waterfowl-friendly practice. Now, when the burn ban came in effect, most producers transitioned over to winter flooded rice, and this, if anything, proved to be an even more waterfowl-friendly practice. But what we're concerned about now is the drought has interjected a lot of uncertainty in terms of the long-term reliability, affordability of surface water supplies for winter flooding. And we're really concerned about where this practice is going to go, even in the post-drought era. We're concerned especially that rice producers, they still need to get rid of their straw. If surface water isn't available at the level it hasn't traditionally been available, then they may have to turn to practices like this, which is essentially involves deep plowing, burying a lot of that seed, and essentially you don't have the food resources provided by rice that you once had. And really they account for almost half the food sources currently available. A recent study put the cost of replacing winter flooded rice with managed wetlands in the Central Valley at over $2 billion. So that's not going to happen, obviously, for a bunch of reasons, but what we're asking here today is not only to find really as much water as possible to winter flood in the context in the face of the drought, but we think that's important in terms of kind of alleviating the problems we expect to face this year, but also I think it sends a strong message going forward to producers that, hey, we recognize this is an important practice, we recognize these are difficult times, but we're committed to providing those surface water supplies going into the future. Turn it over to Mark.
A question before the chart that you had that projects the food supply versus food demand for 2015. Does that take into account all the factors that you had relating to the drought with respect to summer irrigation as well as fall as well as winter flooding?
Yes, that supply curve, if you will, that earlier table that showed what
Planted
we
rice.
expected the landscape would look like this year, that's essentially reflecting that, those
So
declines.
all those 5 factors?
Yes, yes. That captures all those 5 factors.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Reynolds. I'm lead scientist for the California Migratory Bird Program of the Nature Conservancy. I'm here representing the Nature Conservancy as well as our Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership with Audubon, California and Point Blue Conservation Science. And I'm going to talk about a group that we haven't heard much about yet today, and that's shorebirds. So this is an overview of my remarks related to shorebird natural history and how it relates to California situation, including the dependence on seasonal shallow water habitats, managed wetlands agriculture, and the drought stress that is being presented to these animals by the current drought. And this, as you'll see, will reinforce a lot of the points that Mark Petrie and others have made about the importance of compatible agriculture for wildlife. So what is a shorebird and why do we care about them in the Central Valley? Well, shorebirds are small sandpipers and they breed in the high Arctic regions, and they undertake fantastically long and perilous migrations many thousands of miles across the whole hemisphere. And all along the way they need to find shallow water habitat in high quality to be able to fuel up and continue their migration. And California is a hot spot for migratory shorebirds on the Pacific Flyway. It's really the linchpin of the flyway. And this is the kind of habitat that they need to find in high quality, distributed up and down the flyway, and especially here in California. Shallow water, 2 to 4 inches deep, mudflat-like conditions. So California historically had about 4 million acres of wetlands in the Central Valley, which provided an abundance of these conditions, as Mark and others have mentioned, supported millions of ducks and other waterfowl. For shorebirds, we don't really know historically what the numbers of shorebirds were, but currently the valley holds anywhere between 350,000 shorebirds to 500,000. The high counts on a monthly basis are about 350,000. And again, this is being supported in a much diminished wetland acreage, and the birds are depending instead on flooded agriculture. There are 2 internationally recognized hotspots for migratory shorebirds in the Central Valley that have been designated as international conservation areas. One is in the Sacramento Valley ricelands, and the other is around the Grasslands Refuge Complex. So these are hemispherically important, and what happens in California for shorebirds will definitely have ramifications for the whole flyway. So the story is not good for shorebirds. Across the country, across the world, wetland conversion and water management and other threats are affecting shorebird populations. And so here's a graph from the State of the Birds report last year showing North American shorebird populations have experienced a 50% decline in population since the 1970s. This is mirrored in California. In California, the seasonal dynamics of shorebirds are really important to consider. When they arrive here in the summer months, they have just completed breeding and they're coming down to look for food and to fuel up for the rest of their migration. Some of them spend the rest of the fall and into the winter here. But these time periods, August through October and March through April, are critically important to these shorebird populations. These are also the time periods that are most being affected by how we're managing water associated with the drought. Those time periods are also the places where conservation groups have really been mobilizing for the benefit of shorebirds. So NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, our colleagues in waterfowl programs, as well as the Nature Conservancy, have been working with farmers to create ideal conditions for shorebirds. And in the past few years, we've been very successful in creating about 25,000 acres of additional habitat in the fall and the spring for these shorebirds. This would absolutely not be possible without the availability of water in the system associated with winter flooded rice and with rice stubble decomposition. We've been learning a lot about the availability of surface water through a program looking at NASA Landsat satellite imagery with Point Blue. And what we've been finding is these time periods in the spring and fall, the last 2 years of drought, we're seeing 50% reduction over historic averages in the amount of surface water available during these time periods that are critical for shorebirds. Again, shorebirds have these long distance migrations. They have high energetic requirements. They have declining populations hemispherically and globally. They have very low productivity. And all this presents an environment with a lot of stress and potential mortality for them. So drought after drought is certainly affecting adult survivorship and return to the breeding areas. The seasonal effects are distributed non-randomly, so less water in the fall and spring when shorebirds need it most is really most likely to affect the populations negatively. And in the long term, we could be seeing decreased survivorship and crashing populations. So this is a postcard from the future from shorebirds. Shorebird habitat enhancement programs really depend on reliable and cost-effective water, and this is where our partnerships with agriculture and ag water users have been most effective. So how do we deal with this? I think along with others, we're recommending that we look for opportunities to adaptively manage this system and to provide flexibility and look for opportunities to provide water for wildlife in conjunction with other uses. Again, the importance of maintaining decomposition and winter flooded rice programs couldn't be stressed enough for these birds in particular. And we also should look for opportunities to manage and mitigate the effects of water transfer and fallowing. And of course, it's important that we all collaborate with you all and with all of our partners to balance the needs of birds with the needs of fish. Thank you very much.